you know live Senate video is now available at youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. Did you know live Senate video is now available at youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia? Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300.
Good morning and welcome to the first Senate Finance and Appropriations Public Safety Subcommittee of the 2025 session. Let's start by having each senator introduce themselves. Senator Pillion, can you start us off?
I'm Senator Todd Pillion, representing the 6th Senate District in the counties of Lee, Scott, Wise, Washington, Russell, Dickinson, Buchanan, the cities of Norton and Bristol.
Ryan McDougall. I live in Hanover, represent there, New Kent, James City County, Gloucester, Matthews, and King and Queen. Also a former prosecutor and still practice law, which I'll be leaving here to go do quickly.
Adam Eben. I live in Alexandria, represent the 39th District. That also includes parts of Arlington and Fairfax.
And I'm Louise Lucas. I used to have 12 localities. Thank God for compactness. I now represent Portsmouth and Chesapeake. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Senator Dave Marsden, 35th District, and I represent Central Fairfax County.
Good morning. Ghazala Hashmi, representing the 15th Senatorial District, which is parts of the city of Richmond and Chesterfield County.
Thank you, Senators. We have less than 3 weeks this session until we have to report out our Senate budget. And as you all know, over the past few years, the General Assembly has provided significant investments in public safety, including raising salaries for public safety officers, increasing funding for local police, and providing violence reduction grants to communities. Today, we'll be briefed on the proposed amendments in the governor's budget from the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, Secretary Terry Cole, as well as from committee staff. Throughout the presentation, I encourage members of the subcommittee to think about what questions they have both for the agencies and our staff. And with that, we'll start out today with Secretary Cole's presentation. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary, and please begin.
First, I would like to start by thanking our first responders, our law enforcement, our fire EMS, our correctional officers, and our juvenile justice detention officers, and our staff that is currently here today, along with our appreciation for our military folks that are here and our troops that are currently serving our beautiful country. So the commitment of public safety has been to reduce violent crime, to secure the homeland through the Homeland Security Bureau, our first responders' wellness, and officer recruitment. As we talk about addressing violent crime, we see that violent crime is down in Virginia. And it's down in Virginia thanks to the hardworking efforts of local, state, and federal law enforcement. So I want to thank them for those efforts. When we talk about, here we go. The governor's introduced budget, we see there's an increase in inmate medical costs at DOC and for fiscal year 26, an expanded dental service for inmates at DOC, funding for mobile classrooms, providing funding and proposed for legislative session for 2025, an increase in community correction use, providing funds for public safety communication infrastructure, funding temporary detention facilities and ECOs. This has been a critical issue presenting local, state, and our sheriffs with TDOs and ECOs. Increased funding for the school resource officers, providing protective equipment for local firefighters, providing funding to address the increased costs in admissions and placement and contracted services at DJJ, provide non-general funds supporting Virginia Criminal Justice Information Network upgrades at VSP, procure additional live scan machines at VSP, and provide the salary increase for sworn positions at VSP. The budget priorities, critical for an additional $6.8 million in FY25 for additional SROs to support DCJS, $35.2 million to tackle the ECO TDO pilot program expansion statewide, in addition $3.5 million for law enforcement transportation reimbursement, $2.5 million for public safety communication infrastructure grants, $5 million for firefighter breathing apparatus grants from fire programs, $688,000 for additional staffing for state fire marshals, and $2.1 million for reentry, career, and technical educational mobile classrooms at DOC. I'll hold for any comments or questions regarding
Members
those.
have questions at this point? This is good. Please continue.
Thank you, sir. When we talk about officer wellness and public safety wellness, first responder wellness, we've stood up the Office of First Responder Wellness through the Secretariat, along with the Department of Criminal Justice Services. This is a joint effort between VSP, VDEM, and fire programs to consolidate services for our first responders across the Commonwealth. DCGS has received 2 Justice Assistance grants totaling over $1 million. We've held 45 in-person and virtual training courses presented to 550 first responders. We had the first annual First Responder Wellness Conference that took place in September down in Norfolk. We had 350 attendees from throughout the Commonwealth. When we talk about officer recruitment and public safety response to that, we've seen lately an uptick in applications at VSP. Currently, we're recruiting for basic class 144, and we've seen an applicant increase of 50% so far this year. 34% increase with applicants with bachelor's degrees applying to join VSP. We continue to struggle with retention and recruiting at DJJ due to the long hours and violent criminal youth offenders that they're seeing in their facilities. We are seeing more assaults on staff at DJJ and DOC in the recent years, making recruiting and retention extremely difficult. The money that was supplied last year by the General Assembly implemented the Career Progression Guide for DOC. We have seen significant response and uptick to officers wanting to continue their career through the Career Progression Guide at the Department of Corrections. That is extremely encouraging, and I applaud the director, Chad Dodson's efforts in this type of initiative. Any questions in reference to retention or recruiting?
Not directly on that topic, no, but I did want to ask, I understand that the administration redirected $3 million in unspent violence reduction grants to the Office of First Responder Wellness. And I was wondering, what have those funds been used for particularly?
Senator, I can either pivot to DCGS, or I can get you the numbers offline and send them to your officer.
We could follow up privately then.
Yes, sir. Thank you. In reference to Operation Bold Blue Line and Operation Ceasefire, we've seen a decrease in our Bold Blue Line cities of murder by 38%, and a 15% decrease in overall violent crime in our cities. I would like to say that we're also pivoting to help non-Bold Blue Line cities. And I also like to thank Senator Lucas for inviting myself and our team down to talk about the difficult issues you're having in your jurisdiction. It was constructive conversation. I appreciate your willingness to host us and bring the community effort together along with our state, local, and federal partners. We found this dialogue to be extremely important, and I know VSP is directing resources to help with your issues combating violent criminal gangs that are terrorizing your city.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've got a question
Yes, sir.
first from Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While we're on the violent crime subject, we continue in the Commonwealth to have a serious problem with guns being taken from cars. In 2010, we switched from a legal structure where you pretty much had to have a concealed weapons permit to have a gun in your car out of sight. And now in 2010, we switched to anybody can have one in their car as long as it's secured, which means in the door slot, shoved between the seat and the center console. Richmond is experiencing somewhere between 600 and 700 guns stolen from cars a year. Could you share your thoughts on what we might do to deal with this crisis? It's a huge problem in Hampton Roads. It's a huge problem in Lynchburg, even in some rural jurisdictions. But it is shifted as to where we used to have burglary was the way that illegal guns were obtained by many people, and now it's shifted from burglary to cars. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, Senator, thank you for your question. I think the most disturbing part regarding that is a majority of those vehicles are unsecured, and weapons are left in plain view. So I think there's a certain part of educational things that we can do about informing the public and informing gun owners about how to legally possess a weapon and how to keep it secured and how to secure your vehicle. But a majority of the instances you just brought up here in the city of Richmond, those are from unsecured vehicles that are in plain sight.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Yes, Senator Marston.
We've had legislation that's come, I believe, before the governor, to deal with civil penalties for leaving guns in unsecured cars, and they've been vetoed. Do you have any understanding as to why?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I want to pivot back to the Operation Bolt Blue Line.
Yes,
Can you
sir.
just enumerate the cities you mentioned? It's targeted certain localities. Which cities are those?
We have targeted the cities of, off the top of our head, we're in Roanoke.
And that's it. Was that new, or has Roanoke been in there all since the program began?
We brought, it's been there from the start. And the other cities? Petersburg was probably our biggest initiative, and we started there with our efforts. We're currently working down in Newport News as well, and Lynchburg, Norfolk, Martinsville, Portsmouth, and I'd be happy to send you the complete list as well as the results that have transpired from each city
Thank you.
and the amount of resources that we've been spending there. Any other questions for you?
Continue.
Thank you. Jumping into Operation Free, after the governor signed Executive Order 26 to bring the power of the Commonwealth together to combat and defeat the fentanyl crisis, we launched Operation Free. Operation Free was an awareness and education, a reduction, not only to supply and demand enforcement of Virginia's laws, along with attacking the distribution lines. We ran it Operation Free first in April for 30 days. We included 144 jurisdictions throughout the Commonwealth that participated, along with our federal partners to combat fentanyl. And during those 30 days, we ended up seizing 50 pounds of fentanyl. We had such a success with Operation Free 1. We went into Operation Free 2.0. This time we did it for a 45-day surge. During this time, we were contacted by 12 other states in the United States to partner with us to launch the same type of effort. Just in the Commonwealth, during those 45 days, we seized 574 pounds of fentanyl, enough fentanyl to kill every Virginian at least 8 times over. We are planning for another Operation Free 3.0 here in the next couple of months to continue to push forward on this eradication of fentanyl. I think one of our biggest successes has been the educating our youth, educating parents, and getting the word out regarding the dangers of fentanyl. The Mexican cartels still continue to control this territory. They still control the distribution. They still control the border, and they still continue to kill Americans at record levels. Any questions on Operation Free and the fentanyl reduction? I would like to applaud Major Richard Boyd from the Virginia State Police, along with Deputy Secretary Marcus Anderson, who led this effort with coordinating. I mean, this is historic. If you think about Operation Free, the 1.0, 144 local jurisdictions in the Commonwealth came together, broke down silos, shared information, and went out and made their communities safer. You pivot to 2.0 with the success rate of 1.0, 175 agencies come together, And then other states call us to participate with us. And they would like to know our models. They would like to know how we reduce violent criminal activity, how we are attacking the cartels. What is our relationship like with our federal partners? How are we leveraging them all together to help secure Virginia and make Virginia safe? So thank you for your support. Along with that, we see an increased gang activity. We see more members of MS-13 moving into Northern Virginia. We see TDA, the violent criminal gang from Venezuela, currently operating in Washington, D.C., but having their sights with moving into Virginia. We're working with our authorities and partnerships in Washington, D.C. to help tackle the issues that are there so they don't spread to Virginia. Any questions on gang activity before I move to human trafficking?
No, you can continue, please.
Thank you, sir. With our success from Operation Free 1.0 and Operation Free 2.0, we are currently running an initiative with the Human Trafficking Institute that's currently being led by the Virginia State Police regarding human trafficking. Today is the first day of a 45-day cycle where we are bringing the same resources we used in Operation Free 2.0, all our federal and state local partners, to go out and rescue kids. This is a 3 or 4 prong approach, depending how you look at it. It's an educational piece, it's an enforcement piece, but it's also an opportunity for us to provide services to victims that are currently being human trafficked, labor trafficked, or sex trafficked here in the Commonwealth. I would be happy to continue to have this discussion as we proceed with our success over the next 45 days, but I applaud law enforcement, public and private sector folks coming together to tackle human trafficking, especially with the amount of effort being put forth in the public sector with the trucking authorities that are giving us billboards, giving us space, allowing us to bring that message to rescue kids. This will give you a snapshot of what we're currently working. We have 136 active human trafficking cases that are being run at the Virginia State Police and the Human Trafficking Task Force. We have, so far in 2024, 47 victims have been identified and offered services for their overall mental health and well-being. We have the 4th Annual Human Trafficking Summit. It's held with the Attorney General's office, coming for the spring and summer of 2025. And as I mentioned, the current operation is called Operation Silence Shattered. This is a heavy lift, not only on the hearts and mind of law enforcement, but on the folks in the public sector that are out there helping us. And I'd like to applaud Deputy Secretary Lisa Walbert, who's here, who is leading this initiative with our federal, state, and local partners to get this off the ground. This is a Herculean effort, but it's a worthy effort. And when you look at some of the statistics that come out of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Kids, these crimes, these types of crimes, continue to increase. This year, it's up 12%, surpassing 36.2 million reports of this type of behavior, internet crimes against kids. That's nationwide. If you look at Virginia, our statistics are unfortunately off the chart. We have violent predators that lay in the darkness of their rooms or in their basements that are targeting our most vulnerable. And they're targeting these kids as young as middle school, starting to groom them, starting to shape their ideology and their thoughts to lure them away from safety and lure them to these dark corners that we're seeing all over the United States. And if you look at the numbers and the effort by law enforcement to go after these violent criminals, these predators, I applaud their efforts. When I visit the Internet Crimes Against Children's North and South in Virginia, the task forces, they have brave men and women that sit in dark rooms, law enforcement, that just watch these videos that are posted online, the trauma that goes back, that they carry with them after watching these acts of violence and murder. I don't know how they do it day in and day out. We should applaud their effort. We should continue to support their effort. We should continue to provide them the technology that they need to go out and bring these people to justice. Any questions on human trafficking? And
Just a clarification, on slide 13, it says 63,892 tips were escalated to law enforcement reporting threats to a child. Is that in Virginia?
no, sir, that's the
National
nation. Yes, sir,
national
national.
hotline. Okay,
The
thank
next
you.
slide is just Virginia. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. And then the next topic that I'd like to close out with is really the Homeland Security piece. And this is becoming more evident than ever here in the Commonwealth. And I think if you think back in the last couple of years, we've had the drone incursions down in the Tidewater area. These incursions that have been publicly stated and we've shed some light on are extremely concerning from the aspect they're targeting our military, they're targeting our critical infrastructure, and they're targeting what we consider key critical strategic points of our military if we were to have to respond to a national or international incident. What we do know is bad actor states, as we're watching the war in Ukraine and Russia play out, is becoming drone warfare. What we're seeing currently in Mexico with the cartels using drones to drop IEDs, to launch missiles, to deliver drugs, we're seeing that play out on our southern border. But now we're seeing military-type drones hovering over our military-type infrastructure. To better coordinate this response and collection piece, we need to have a stronger footprint with our federal partners in the Department of Defense. As we've heard under recent testimony from Senator Warner, Senator Kaine, nobody has any idea where these drones are coming from. Nobody has any idea who the adversary is, which is very concerning from a national security angle. The Homeland Security Bureau at the Virginia State Police that was stood up will be used to break down those silos between not only the federal government, but our public-private partners around our critical infrastructure, number one, around our military institutions, number two, and those businesses that support that type of commerce. We currently don't have that in place. There's a tremendous amount of 130I, which is recognized as national infrastructure securities by the federal government in Virginia. And there's no liaison back and forth on a regular basis from the state in those businesses. So we literally sometimes fly in the dark and expect the federal government to share everything with us. So we're hoping that the Homeland Security Bureau will break down those silos and establish those communications not only with the federal government, but with those entities as well. And we've had acts of espionage by Chinese students. We've had Chinese students and Chinese members of the Communist Party that have been photographing our critical infrastructure. They've been caught, they've been arrested, they've been prosecuted. Yes, sir. And these are the type of threats we need to continue to monitor. I would look forward to a conversation more in private regarding the drones. There is more information I can share, just not in a public setting, which I would be more than happy to do. And this doesn't even address the drones over our correctional facilities that are regularly dropping contraband. weapons, drugs, Suboxone, I mean, all types of issues. The last drone we had was carrying a 17-pound payload that ran into the fence. It's the only way we seized it at one of our correctional facilities. Those investigations are still ongoing with the Virginia State Police, but this has become more and more apparent to the type of technology that we're all dealing with on a daily basis.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Marsden.
Yeah, the question, do you have a sense of, we always hear that what comes over the border at non-border crossing sites versus what comes through in those, the roads and what have you that bring vehicles back and forth between Mexico for commerce and tourism and what have you. Do you have a sense of where most of this is coming through?
Yeah, I think through my past experience with working with DEA and being in charge in Mexico City, we saw a good majority of the commerce, meaning narcotics, coming across the southern border into California, into Arizona, into Texas. These routes are porous, these routes are open. The masterminds of the Mexican cartels have also shifted to the northern border as well. So now we're seeing more and more, not only human trafficking on the northern border, we're seeing more drug trafficking, more fentanyl, more ecstasy coming in from Canada. And I think that the cartels are very creative. And they're going to find a way to get their commerce into the United States at all costs. But the critical part of securing the border for us, not only on the narcotic trade, but the amount of terrorists that are crossing the border and making their way into the United States, making their way into the Commonwealth, is disturbing on many fronts. Thank you for your question.
Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir, I was curious about the comments on the slide about the threats from Chinese students. Perhaps in a more private setting, we could get more data on the numbers and which universities in particular are affected. My concern is, since 2016, we've seen a significant rise, not just in Virginia, but across the country, of anti-Asian hate. And as we know, we have many students of Chinese origin or Chinese descent who are in our colleges and universities. And so when we put out a statement publicly like this, Chinese students are infiltrating our universities, that impacts an entire community, many of whom are here to advance their degree programs and who are very much contributing to our communities and to our research and to the universities that they are belonging to. So I would like to get more data and more information, more clarity, especially when we put out publicly a statement like this, because it does lead to anti-Asian hate crimes, and that's something that we need to be very sensitive to as we make these pronouncements in a public context like this. So
Yeah, I would look forward to the opportunity to sit down and talk about that, and especially look at what we've seen here in Virginia, but also what we've seen nationwide when it comes to this. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman.
I would like to give the same information, if I could.
Absolutely.
Senator McDougal.
Mr. Chairman, I know not all members of this committee were on courts, but if you were earlier this week, you would have heard Senator Locke introduced a bill because a Chinese national flew a drone over top of one of our shipbuilding facilities, captured images and pictures of some of those facilities, which were top secret, and we have a bill moving through, which all members will have the opportunity to vote on the floor about making that a felony to engage in that kind of activity, which certainly if you were a citizen would be treason, and if you're not a citizen, is certainly an act of, I think, aggression toward the United States. And so there's one act where a person was convicted in Virginia last year of doing this, and it was sponsored by the Chinese government.
Yeah, and I would just expand on what the senator said. When his drone fell out of the sky, he panicked. He got questioned by law enforcement. He ran. He got on a plane. He flew to the West Coast, and they interdicted him there before he got back to China. And in his debrief, which is public record, that's exactly what he said. He was directed by the Chinese People's Republic of China to come and collect information regarding our critical infrastructure right here in Virginia.
Thank you.
And then I'll be open to any questions. That really concludes. The last slide I had was about the Mexican cartels, but we kind of touched on that as we were going through. And CJ&G and Sinaloa continue to be the dominant cartels that are sending this poison to the United States.
Do members of the subcommittee have any additional questions for Secretary Cole at this time? Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, sir. And thank Katie for getting us all together. Anything else?
Katie, are we going to now have a staff overview of the amendments? Or
That's
okay.
correct. I'm going to do a quick overview of the governor's amendments to the budget. And you can see there's a lot of staff here. To the extent you all have questions, of course, ask me, and then I can make use of staff if I don't know. So just kind of a high-level overview, starting with slide 2. So the biggest items, I think, in the governor's introduced budget are the $6.8 million for school resource officers that the Secretary mentioned, $5 million for the firefighter protective equipment, and an additional $4.7 million for operations at the 2 new Veterans Care Centers. We'll go into those in more detail in these slides. So turning to the next slide, the Department of Corrections inmate healthcare cost increases. We haven't seen this for a couple years because I think they weren't really sure what the projections were coming out of COVID, and they over-projected, but now we're kind of back to that year-over-year increase that we've been seeing in inmate healthcare costs. My understanding from the Department of Corrections that this is driven a lot by specialty drugs, prices increasing, and then there had been a decline in off-site services, like just, folks getting outpatient clinics, inmates, and that has rebounded more than we thought it would from COVID. So now we're kind of going back to the fiscal year 2018 levels as opposed to the lower levels we saw during COVID. So that's kind of the inmate health care. In terms of the career and technical education mobile classrooms, these are, as they sound, they're trailer mobile classrooms. They're going to be focused on lower level facilities. Currently, a lot of the HVAC and technical CTE stuff that the Department of Corrections does is more at the higher level facilities. This would be able to go to the lower level offenders. And my understanding is they're going to do the staff through existing vacancies. So the idea is that if they just need the physical space, and then they can absorb the staffing costs that would come with that.
Do we have detail on what that buys us in terms of how many classrooms or how many facilities will be affected?
3 mobile trailers. I might have to defer if DOC knows to how many facilities they would be able to rotate to. Marcus, I don't know if you know. If not, we can get back. Okay, we can get back with you on that.
Thank you.
So this next one, expand dental services for inmates. So essentially what this is 2 mobile dentist teams. I think it would be like a hygienist. There's 3 staff for each, a hygienist, a dentist, and then 1 more staff. Currently, essentially what the department is doing is they've tried to contract with Anthem and Jet Dental to have a mobile team to address often class 2 issues. My understanding is that's routine care like tooth extractions. Basically, this is just to expand that, to try to work down that backlog of more routine care. So this is kind of 2 mobile teams, and I believe the idea is that they would bring them in-house as opposed to keeping their Jet Dental contract. And so we can kind of talk about how that's structured. And then the last item for Department of Corrections, so expand community supervision electric monitoring. I think the main piece of this is Shadow Track. I'm new to this, so I'll explain it. Y'all might know. But Shadow Track is essentially an app. Historically, the department had been using it for low-risk offenders. It allows you to submit things through a secure portal. You can connect with your probation officer by text or by video. And really, before it had been used for lower level. And the department has made a decision to expand it to all offenders, both because of what the app can do, but also if you were to abscond and you were to log into your app that can provide a notification. So I think that's kind of a dual purpose thing. It's just a tool that the department is expanding to additional offenders, and this represents the increased cost from that. Going to DJJ, so Secretary mentioned cost increases for committed youth. This is really two parts. One part, there's about $1.8 million for intake services, and I believe, and if you have questions, the Department of Juvenile Justice is here, but kind of what's going on is there's been longer stays, and so the CAP intake is essentially when a juvenile is committed, they go into the intake, and that's kind of where they are until they get their permanent placement. And there's been an increase in how long juveniles have been in that. There's also been a slight increase in the number of juveniles just coming into the system compared to COVID. Still much lower than previous years, but a little higher than COVID. And then the rate that the juvenile detention centers are charging for those intake services is increased. So that kind of is what's going off that 1.8. It's those increased contract costs from the intake, or juveniles in intake. And then the other piece is $1.3 million for contracted services. A lot of this is pre-placement, which is a new thing that the department started. So the expansion of those services is leading to these cost increases. I'll pause there for questions, then I'll do state police, but feel free to jump in at any time.
Are there questions up to now for Katie, what we've heard? Okay, why don't you continue?
Sure. So for state police, this is an item that was included last year. You may remember that a few years ago, the General Assembly funded a new pay plan for state police officers, and that has stemmed some of the tide of some of their recruitment efforts. This is essentially to keep giving officers on top of the statewide increase. This would give them an additional 1.4% pay step. Last year, the Senate or the conference report and the final budget essentially gave them a compression adjustment, so an amount to address compression, but not this kind of annual predicted 1.4% on top of statewide increases. So this is kind of a re-ask of that. The next item, upgrade live scan fingerprint machines. Essentially, these are what criminal justice agencies use for electronic fingerprinting. The state police upgraded their system using ARPA funds a couple years ago. This would be for local and other criminal justice services agencies to access those upgrades. And just to flag that this is only a portion, there's, I believe, about 800 that would probably need an upgrade to access these kind of new features of the new, and this would only fund about 180 of them. So this would be kind of the first piece of that. The next thing is large.
Google has a question.
Oh, yes, Senator
Thank you,
McDougal.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one of the things I would like us to stay focused on and maybe have a discussion is on the salary increases for state police pay step. Those are all very good, but one of the implications or impacts that we see is then it creates a incentive for individuals who've already been trained by local sheriffs or police departments to transition from those jurisdictions to state police because they can make more money. And so I am continuing to hear that from sheriffs across my area, particularly in smaller jurisdictions where they do not have the ability to supplement the pay as much as some larger jurisdictions. Right. So in Fairfax, maybe even Virginia Beach, Henrico, yeah. So we need to be very conscious of that as we're doing, making pay increases for state police, that we're also doing comparable increases for sheriffs to not create that cannibalism between departments.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Marsden.
it appears that the flow has changed directions. It used to be the state police had a problem keeping people because they'd come out of the academy and go to local government where they could get hired. Now it seems to be flipping. It's a really tough balancing act.
Mr. Chair, if there are no more questions, I'll move to the next slide, Department of Criminal Justice Services and other agencies. So this is the School Resource Officer Incentive Grants. Just as a reminder, so last year what the conference report did was essentially adjust the School Resource Officer grants to accommodate the existing obligations that we knew, so the continuing grants, and then also you all provided an additional $4.7 million for new grants. And so just kind of a reminder of where we were with that, but because of that kind of adjustment to utilization last year, this is an ask in the governor's budget to increase this to be closer to where it had been before the final budget adjusted that down to kind of reflect the uptake in grants. This next item that the secretary did mention, law enforcement, civil commitment, transportation, again, just to kind of put this in context. So the General Assembly had provided a one-time grant program to reimburse law enforcement officers for overtime and costs like that associated with these ECO, TDO, transportation and custody. This new grant program would only be used for transportation, and then there's a companion request in the Health and Human Resources to essentially pay SCOP, state conservators, or the peace to sit with them. So the idea is this would reimburse law enforcement officers, and then the SCOPs might stay with them, and that's kind of the companion proposal. Public safety communication infrastructure grants, I won't spend much time on this because I believe Senator Obenshain has a bill that will be before you at some point where we'll talk about this. This next item, Criminal Justice Academies testing module, a one-time thing for the regional criminal justice academies to kind of decrease administrative burden on their end to submit the testing results from law enforcement or from officers who are testing to get their certification. Office of Attorney General Victim Assistance Grant. This is a current grant that goes from the Victim Witness Program to the Office of the Attorney General. It relates to victim notification and victim support for individuals whose case is under appeal. This would backfill a little bit of the decline in federal, but the majority of it would be to either expand the grant or just supplant money that's currently in the Office of Attorney General's budget.
And how is that different than other victim assistance programs? You mentioned people who had an appeal.
Yes, I might have to, unless John or anyone from Department of Criminal Justice Services is able to speak to it, I might have to get with the Office of the Attorney General to kind of understand their role versus the local victim services agencies, but Tracy or John?
don't have details on hand, we can get you details, but there are 3 state agencies that have specific roles for victim services that are different than what the locals do.
We can get that breakdown.
Thank you. And I think Senator McDougall wanted to make a comment.
Mr. Chairman, just as we're looking at this area as well, I think one of the things that over time we've missed is that our victim services units, which are either located by a local jurisdiction, can be independent or in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. I think they're set up different ways. We've funded items for victims that for victim services groups that cannot be one of those. And so we've had some challenges funding and maintaining personnel because those victim services units are typically the ones that deal with individuals who have protective orders that they're trying to file or are the direct victims of crimes. And so as we go through this process, I do think we need to look at that funding and make sure it's opened up for those as well and not excluded.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the next item is Office of First Responder Wellness. We talked about this a little bit, but this would essentially fund a position at the Department of Criminal Justice Services. Currently, this is done through grants for things like critical incident stress management for officers. This would provide more infrastructure and support for those grants, both through position and operational funds. I'll skip this is pretty self-explanatory, drug abuse resistance, the DARE program. This is a small increase. I believe it's the York-Pocosin Commonwealth Attorney or Sheriff's Office that runs this program statewide. So this would be a small increase for them, and I'll make sure I'm get that right with you all. The next item, so this is $5 million. I believe, and I think some folks here can speak to this as well, but there was a study last year that was included in the budget about essentially the sufficiency of EMS and fire services. A majority, I think it's like 97% of fire EMS funding is local. And so this is just to kind of lift some of that burden because of strains on certain local funding. Some of them have had trouble buying things like equipment, buying things like vehicles. This would be for non-vehicular equipment, so things like breathing apparatuses, just a new grant program. Fire marshal positions, so this is also kind of a repeat from a request you all have seen in the past. The fire marshal obviously does state inspections. Mostly they're just covering mandated inspections like hospitals and assisted living facilities. But the fees have not been raised since the early 2000s. And there's also been an increase in a workload for areas that the state can't charge a fee, like the code prohibits them from charging a fee. So I'll kind of get a breakdown of that workload, but it's basically increasing workload that they can't charge a fee for, and then for things they can charge a fee for, the code, they have not adjusted the fee since the early 2000s. Just the other two that I'll touch on here, forensic science, 4 positions, a couple to help maintain their new laboratory, and then a couple forensic biologists for increasing caseloads. And then the item for the parole board is basically turning 2 existing positions into supervisory positions. Moving to the next slide. So just a few items for Department of Veterans Services. The largest is $4.7 million for the Veterans Care Centers. You'll remember that last year the General Assembly provided $19.1 million for these 2 new centers. It's Jones Cabocoy in Virginia Beach and Puller up in Fauquier County. And the General Assembly asked the Department of Veterans Services to come back with a plan of essentially after you've spent the $19.1 million, show us how you can be self-sufficient. I think there were some delays in Puller opening and some other things that maybe the department can speak to, but they had asked for more last year, and so they're coming back to ask for $4.7 million on top of the 19.1. So that's kind of a summary of what that is here. And then a few small things for the Department of Veterans Services, some increase in IT costs, and then an outreach position to basically go on bases to make folks on bases more aware of services for Virginia veterans.
So, Mr. Chair,
Senator Pilliam.
so are they still coming up with a plan on how to become self-sufficient, even though they're asking for more money?
Madam Chair, Senator Pillian, they have not submitted anything. They have submitted me some data that's very helpful, but they have not actually submitted a formal plan. I believe their out-year estimates for Puller, which is supposed to open in 2025, still shows them as deficient in fiscal year 2028, but it does show Jones Cabocoy as eventually becoming self-sufficient. I believe it's around fiscal year 27. So we do have some numbers. We don't have a formal plan, and I know Deputy Secretary Stewart and some of them are up here if they have anything additional they'd like to add or you have additional questions.
Does the Deputy Secretary want to comment now or get back to us about the self-sufficiency aspect?
I would defer to our Deputy Commissioner of Veterans Services.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Thank you. Steve Combs, Deputy Commissioner, Department of Veterans Services. That plan is being finalized and should be to you very shortly.
Okay, thank you. And while you're at the podium, I don't know if you're the appropriate one to ask. The Veterans Care Center is set to open this coming summer, right?
Yes, sir.
But were $2 million in operating expenses spent in this past year?
That's correct. We have 14 team members are on board right now.
I see.
That includes the administrator, the director of nursing, the director of marketing and outreach. Basically, your core team that you would need to hire the next 45 people, such as when you're ready to admit resident number 1, you have to have a team of about 60 people on board to be able to care for resident number 1. Sure. And then you're admitting residents and you're growing one household at a time until you're reaching that near full occupancy of 128 residents.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think the only 2 final items I have are just a couple language items. There is one, I believe you all have seen this, but one is essentially language that would withhold compensation board and jail per diem payments, as well as 599 or aid to local police departments funding from any official of a facility where an alien is incarcerated that doesn't comply with a lawful U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE detainer or does not provide a 48-hour pre-release notification. And then the prohibition or the required withholding of those comp board and 599 funds also applies to such officials as well as local law enforcement agencies who impede cooperation or communication with ICE pursuant to a local ordinance, policy, procedure, or custom. And I believe just the other kind of language item that just wanted to make sure you all were aware of, this is something that had been in the budget, but that was removed in the conference report in the final budget last year that prohibits state inmates from, or the language was put back in that prohibits state inmates from earning earned sentence credits at the enhanced rate if any portion of their concurrent or consecutive sentence includes an offense that is eligible. So essentially, if you have a consecutive or concurrent and one of your offenses is ineligible for the enhanced rate, you don't get the enhanced rate in your whole sentence. So I think that is a conclusion of my presentation, but more than happy to answer any questions or call other folks up.
Members of the subcommittee have any additional questions Katie at this time? Okay, thank you for the walkthrough and for the explanations.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that at this point, we will, unless there's other business. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. I meant to ask this of Secretary Cole, and nothing that we need to address right now, but I was hoping to also receive some data on domestic terrorism here in Virginia, and if we could get some data and some sense of what our Homeland Security is doing to address domestic terrorism and the rise of militia, that would be really helpful.
Okay, can we get that as a follow-up? As a follow-up, we'll get that. Thank you, sir. Okay, with that, our meeting is concluded.
The Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300.